The Three Rules of the Mist. The first time Eonin heard the three rules, he was still no taller than the lowest ferns along the path. His grandmother told him on a grey afternoon while she hung small bundles of heather by the door, and the wind carried the smell of damp peat, drying wool, and rain that had not yet begun to fall. Their house stood at the edge of the valley, where the land of men began to soften and grow quieter, and where the ancient hills started, covered in dark grass, standing stones, and paths no one had ever fully made. Eonin's grandmother was named Maeli. Her hands were fine and knotted, like old roots. She did not speak often, but when she did, it felt as though she were setting the world back into place with her voice. That afternoon, she lit the fire slowly, one spark, then another, then the hearth drawing breath. Eonin sat on the bench under the window, his knees scraped, a little twig turning between his fingers. He had spent the whole day chasing hens, peering at insects in puddles and tossing pebbles into the stream. In his mind, the northern forest was only a beautiful shadow beyond the meadows. "Listen carefully," Miley said, still without looking at him. "Before you grow any taller and decide to run farther than your name can follow, you need to know this." Eonin set the twig down. Rain began to tap softly on the roof. "There are 3 rules for entering the forest." The boy felt that sweet shiver that came with everything forbidden and everything important. "Which forest?" he asked, though he already knew. At last his grandmother lifted her eyes. Firelight glowed in them. "The forest that begins where the hill bends. The one of the old hazels, the one that keeps its mist even in summer." Eonin swallowed. He knew that place from a distance. No one ever said, "Let's go there," with the same ease they used for, "Let's go to the river," or "Let's go to the pastures." The forest had a different weight to it, a different way of staying in the mind. "What are they?" he whispered. Maeli folded her hands in her lap. "The first, take nothing." Eonin nodded at once, though he did not fully understand. "The second, do not promise too quickly." He nodded again, more slowly this time. "And the third," she said as the fire crackled at that same moment, "never mock the mist." For a while there was only the sound of rain, the low murmur of the pot beginning to boil, and the soft hiss of a drip falling at the threshold. Eonin, who was exactly the age when children begin wanting reasons for everything, frowned. "And why?" His grandmother smiled faintly, not with joy, with patience. "Because the forest hears, because sometimes it gives back what pleases it, and sometimes it keeps what does not know how to respect it. Because the mist is not only low water, however much village men pretend to believe that." Eonin looked toward the window. Outside, the last of the evening light had turned a deep blue. "Do the fair neighbors live there?" he asked very quietly. In that house, no one ever used names that were too exact at dusk. There were safer ways of naming things. The fair neighbors, the kindly folk, the old ones, those on the other side of the hill, the voices beneath the roots. Miley leaned forward to stir the fire. "The forest lives there," she answered, "and sometimes that is enough." She said no more. She did not need to. In that house, stories were never handed over all at once. They were left nearby like a lamp already lit. Each person moved closer when they were ready. For days, Eonin repeated the rules to himself while he ran errands. "Take nothing, do not promise too quickly, never mock the mist." He liked the order of the words. They seemed simple to him, almost too simple, as if the forest had visiting rules the way another family's house might. In the valley, summer came slowly. The morning smelled of wet grass and warm milk. Sheep dotted the hillsides in white. Women hung washing in the sun whenever the clouds broke. Men mended fences, checked nets, spoke little, and watched the sky a great deal. And always, To the north, the forest. From far away, it looked like a great green and blue back. Hazels, birches, ash trees, holly. On some dawns, the edge of the trees seemed closer than on others, as though during the night it had taken a few steps down into the valley. No one ever remarked on that. There were things that stayed still if they were left unsaid. But a child notices what adults decide not to notice. Eonan began to watch everything. That crows never flew over the heart of the forest, but around it. That cows, if they strayed too near the boundary, would lift their heads and snort before turning away. That on some days a sound drifted out from between the trunks that was not wind, not water, not bird call, something like music, half remembered. That the mist, when it was born there, did not move the way river mist did. That mist seemed to choose. At the end of summer, a small fair came to the valley. Not a great city fair, but a gathering of wagons, blankets spread on the grass, copper pots, oat bread, needles, buckles, salves, songs and news brought in from distant roads. To Eonan it felt as if the whole world had suddenly decided to visit him. His mother gave him 2 thin coins and told him not to get lost. His grandmother smoothed his hair with one hand and said nothing, which in her case meant almost the same as saying a great deal. At the fair he met Bran. Bran was a year older, maybe 2, thin, quick, with the easy grin of someone who had not yet fully learned to measure his words. He had come with an uncle who sold small goods from place to place, and he seemed to know a little about everything. He could whistle through a leaf. He could tell a hare's tracks from a fox's. He could lie with a smoothness that fascinated Eonan from the very first moment. Before noon, they were already running together between the stalls. After noon, they were sharing a honey loaf. And before evening, Bran had already coaxed out of him the confession that he had never set foot in the northern forest. Never? Bran said, his eyes wide with delighted shock. Not even as far as the first clearing. They don't let me. They don't let me do plenty of things either. There was a special kind of pride inside that answer. The pride of someone who turns prohibition into invitation. They sat on a stone with dusty feet and honey sticky on their elbows. Somewhere in the distance, someone played a small harp. The air smelled of sweet smoke, spilled ale, and apples. They say the edge of the forest has hazelnuts bigger than your fist, Bran said, and blue mushrooms, and ribbons hanging from branches that nobody dares to touch. Eonan looked toward the hills. My grandmother says there are 3 rules. Bran laughed shortly. There are always rules whenever grown-ups are afraid. It's not fear. What is it then? Eonan thought of Maeli's voice, the fire, the rain on that grey afternoon. Respect, he said at last. Bran pulled a blade of grass loose with his teeth. Sometimes respect and fear wear the same cloak. The line sounded very wise to Eonan, too wise. He liked it and disliked it at the same time. They kept playing until the sky began to turn gold. Then Bran pointed with his chin toward the northern hills. We could just go as far as the edge, he suggested. We don't have to go in very far. Eonan felt a quick beat in his chest. I have to go home. There's still light. My mother. Your mother won't even know. We'll go, look, and come back. Maybe we'll pick one huge hazelnut and you can show it to your grandmother. The word hazelnut hung between them, round and shining like a very small temptation. Eonan remembered the first rule. Take nothing. I'm not supposed to take anything. Bran shrugged. If a hazelnut's already fallen, that isn't taking, that's finding. The logic was weak, but it had just enough of the sound of something reasonable, and the afternoon was beautiful, and the forest had been waiting for so many days in the distance that suddenly it felt impossible not to go nearer at least once. They walked uphill through gorse bushes and lichen-covered stones. The sounds of the fair fell behind them, first to a murmur, then to a memory, Ahead, the air grew cooler, greener, more still. The edge of the forest was not a sharp line. It was a transition: grass, fern, shade, roots, as if the earth itself were changing its mind little by little. Bran was the first to step beneath the branches. Eonin followed. Everything seemed to soften the moment they entered. The light was rounder, the ground gave slightly beneath their feet. It smelled of wet leaves, moss, damp husks, old wood. Above them the hazels wove, together with the birches, and let through threads of pale sun. There was nothing frightening there. That was Eonin's first thought, and that first calm gave him a false kind of confidence. He heard insects humming, the soft brush of a branch, the little knock of an acorn falling somewhere out of sight. Everything seemed gentle, almost homely. "You see?" Bran murmured. "It's just a forest." Eonin did not answer. They walked through high ferns. They found a hollow trunk covered with mushrooms like tiny ears. A stream so thin it seemed less to run than to murmur. A cluster of white stones gathered too closely together to have rolled there by chance. The boy kept repeating to himself, "Take nothing, do not promise too quickly, never mock the mist." He did not know why repeating the words made him feel braver. Perhaps because the rules were like having his grandmother walking beside him. They came to a small, round clearing bordered with foxgloves and tall grass. In the center stood a lone hawthorn. 3 faded ribbons hung from one of its branches, nearly worn through by time: white, blue, red. Eonin stopped. "I don't like this," he said. "They're just scraps of cloth," Bran replied. But he did not go toward them. Not even he did that. To one side of the clearing, beside a root that rose from the earth, lay 3 hazelnuts, large, smooth, shining with an almost golden chestnut color. Bran gave a low whistle. "Told you." He crouched at once. "No," Eonin blurted. "Too fast, too loud." Bran looked at him. "What?" "We mustn't. They're on the ground. That doesn't matter." Bran turned one hazelnut with the tip of his fingers, but did not yet take it. He smiled with a mixture of mischief and challenge. "Your grandmother filled your head with stories." Heat rushed into Eonin's ears. "They're not stories." Bran straightened again, leaving the hazelnut where it was. All right, don't take anything. Look how I tremble." He moved a few steps away. Eonin breathed more easily. He wanted to believe that was enough, that he had remembered in time and so all was well, that the rules were easy when you kept them close enough. Then he heard a voice, not a loud one, a near one, as though someone were speaking just behind his shoulder in the most natural way. "Boy." Eonin spun around. There was no one there. Bran had turned too, but toward another side of the clearing. "Did you say something?" Bran asked. "No." The clearing looked exactly the same. The hawthorn, the ribbons, the hazelnuts, the grass only slightly bending. Then the voice came again. "Grey-eyed boy." This time Eonin could tell it was coming from the edge of the clearing, near a holly bush. Among the glossy leaves stood a figure. He could not say how he had failed to see her before. She was a woman, or seemed to be a woman, very slender, black hair braided long with little white twigs caught in it, a moss-colored mantle, bare feet. Her face was not frightening. It was calm, too calm, like the still surface of a pool that does not let you see the bottom. Bran opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The woman inclined her head a fraction. "I will ask only once," she said. "Did you come with empty hands?" Eonin felt his chest tighten the way it did when stepping into very cold water. He looked at his hands. He held nothing but a blade of grass stuck to one palm. "Yes," he answered, and his voice came out small. The figure smiled slightly. Then she looked at Bran. Bran waited a beat too long. "Yes," he said as well. The woman watched him in silence. Then her eyes lowered to one of the pockets of the boy's tunic. Bran went rigid. With clumsy fingers, he reached in and pulled out one hazelnut, then another. Small, ordinary ones, the kind he had gathered on the path earlier, outside the clearing perhaps, or perhaps not. Eonin did not know, but he understood that the lie mattered more than where they had come from. The woman did not lose her calm. "Return them to where they were meant," she said. Bran swallowed. He bent down and set the hazelnuts at the foot of the hawthorn beside the others. The wind passed over the clearing with a sound like an exhalation. The woman looked back at Eonin. "You listen well at home," she said. "That helps." And then, with the same natural ease with which she had appeared, she was no longer there. She did not walk away. She did not fade like smoke. She simply was not where she had been. Bran let out his breath all at once. "Did you see her?" Eonin nodded. "We have to go." "Yes." They left the clearing too quickly, though neither of them ran. The branches seemed lower now, the light paler. The forest no longer felt homely. Not hostile either, only attentive. They walked in silence for several minutes. It was Bran who finally broke it. "I didn't promise her anything," he said in a thin voice, as though defending himself before an invisible judge. "No. And I put the hazelnuts back." "Yes. So nothing happened." Eonin did not answer, because something had happened. He did not know what to call it, but it had happened. And the forest was no longer a distant idea. It was a place that looked back. Then the mist began to form. It did not rise the way river mist rises, spreading outward from a bank. It appeared between the trunks, at knee height first, then at the waist, white, thick, silent. It did not smell of running water or mud. It smelled of cold stone and night flowers. Bran let out a nervous laugh. "Look at that. It's like the forest is cooking." Eonin went still. The third rule came back to him with painful clarity. Never mock the mist. "Don't say stupid things," he murmured. Bran, perhaps because he was afraid and did not want to look afraid, raised his voice a little. "Oh, great forest mist, forgive me for troubling you with my boots." The imitation was clumsy, almost childish, but the lightness in the tone was enough. Every sound went out. No insects, no birds, no stream. Only Eonin's heart, pounding. Bran stopped smiling. The mist kept rising slowly until their legs vanished inside it. The nearby trunks began to look farther away. The clearing they thought they had left no longer stood where it should have been. Or perhaps it did. Or perhaps now all the trees looked too alike. "Come on," Bran said. He took one step, then another. He looked back. Eonin was still beside him. They walked straight, or believed they did. But moments later, the same white stones appeared again, and the same hollow trunk, and a knot in an ash tree shaped like a closed eye. Bran started breathing faster. "We're going in circles." Eonin felt the urge to call for his grandmother, his mother, anyone who belonged to the world where things kept a safe shape. But he knew shouting would not help him. The mist slipped between them with patient slowness. Then, very near, a voice different from the first one said, "Do you mock what you cannot see?" Eonin turned toward the thick whiteness. There was no figure, only the sense of something listening through the damp. Bran was trembling. "I didn't," he began, but the words tangled on his tongue. Eonin closed his fingers. He thought of the fire at home, of Miley's voice, of how she set the world in place with her sentences. And with all the calm he could gather, he said, "We have been foolish. We did not come to command or to laugh. We only want to leave without giving more offense." The air stayed still. Bran looked at him as if he had never truly seen him before. Then, from some place impossible to point to, came a faint sound. One bell, then another, then the soft chiming of many sheep moving across a distant slope. Eonin knew that sound. His uncle's flock wore small copper bells, sharper in tone than most. "That way," he whispered. He caught Bran by the sleeve and moved slowly toward the sound, without running, without pushing the mist aside with his hands, as though they were walking inside a church. The chiming came again, clearer now, higher up. They followed it. Little by little, the mist began to thin. A thread of wind opened between the trunks, and with it came a familiar smell: heather, wet wool, peat smoke. The smell of the valley, the smell of houses. Eonan felt it like a warm hand at the back of his neck. The mist sank to chest height, then to the waist, then to the knees. The trees opened a little wider. Ahead of them appeared a slope, covered in ferns bent down by some animal path. Bran and Eonan climbed without speaking. At the top of the rise, they saw, below them, a fenced meadow and 3 grey sheep with bells around their necks. They were not his uncle's sheep, but the sound had been enough to lead them there. The forest remained behind them. Not far, not entirely, but behind. Bran dropped to his knees in the grass. Eonan stayed on his feet, breathing as though he had been running hard, though he had not run at all. The sky had turned the deep blue of late evening. Over the hills, a pale band of light still held on. Down in the village, a few windows had already begun to glow. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Bran dragged his hands over his face. "I'm never going back," he muttered. Eonan looked at him. The boy's expression was shattered and honest in the way fright leaves it before there is time to disguise it as bravery. "Neither am I," he said. It was not entirely true. He knew that as soon as he said it. There was fear, yes, but there was also a deeper, more serious curiosity than before. Not the mischievous urge to snatch a secret out of the world, but the desire to know how to look without spoiling what he saw. Even so, that day he wanted no thought of ever returning. They went down toward the valley on awkward legs. The fare was being packed away. The wagons were dark shapes against the fires of evening. Someone was calling for a child. Someone was laughing near the ale barrels. Ordinary life was still there, and that felt almost unbelievable. When Miley saw Eonan coming up the stone path, she did not raise her voice. She asked no questions in front of others. She only opened the door and waited. Inside, the warmth of the hearth wrapped around him so quickly that he nearly burst into tears from sheer relief. He took off his boots by the door. His stockings were damp. His hands were cold. His heartbeat still uneven. His mother was kneading bread and frowned. "You're late." But Maely laid a light hand on her arm. "Let him sit first." Eonan sat on the bench beside the fire. His grandmother gave him a cup of hot milk with honey. He held it in both hands without drinking yet. He needed to feel the heat. Miley settled opposite him. "Which rule was hardest?" she asked. The question was so precise that Eonan looked up sharply. "You knew I'd gone. I knew you would come back changed." There was no reproach in her voice, only an old weariness and a kind of resigned tenderness, as though for years she had known the exact shape of the way children learn. Eonan's mother let go of the dough, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned toward them in alarm. "You went into the forest?" He nodded. "With Bran. And that seemed like a good idea to you?" Eonan wanted to answer that it had not at first, that it had later, that he never wanted to again, that maybe someday he might. But none of those answers reached far enough. So he looked down at the cup and said, "No." His mother let out a long breath, half angry and half relieved. She took a wool blanket and set it over his shoulders. "You'll eat, and then you'll sleep. Tomorrow you'll have time enough for remorse." But she stayed close by, kneading more slowly now, listening. Miley waited. "Bran picked up hazelnuts," Eonan said at last. Or maybe he already had them with him. And he lied. A woman from the forest appeared. or something like that. She made him put them back. Then the mist came. Bran mocked it. We got lost. His grandmother closed her eyes for a moment, like someone listening to a familiar song. And what did you do? I asked to leave without offending anymore. Maeli opened her eyes. Good. I didn't know whether it would work. Sometimes knowing the tone matters more than knowing the words. At last the boy took a sip of milk. The honey left a warm trail in his throat. Outside, night had fully closed in. The window glass reflected fire and shadow. Who was she? He asked. Perhaps a guardian of the clearing. Perhaps someone who tends old offerings. Perhaps only one of the many shapes a place can take when it wants to be seen. The answer explained almost nothing, but Eonin felt it was honest, and that was enough. And the mist, he pressed. Maeli tipped her head. The mist is a boundary. The mist is a veil. It helps each thing remain where it belongs. When someone laughs at it, they laugh at a doorway without understanding where it opens. Eonin's mother murmured a brief prayer to the fire, the way some people did on winter nights. Nothing solemn, only a few small words asking for peace for the house and for anyone walking outside it. Then they ate thick broth, dark bread, and cheese. Bran did not appear at any door or window. Eonin wondered how he had been received in his wagon, whether he had told the truth, whether he even knew how to tell it, whether he would tell it in a way that sounded like adventure instead of warning. Eonin hoped not. He hoped yes. He didn't know. He slept badly that night. He dreamed of the hawthorn in the clearing, its ribbons moving without wind. He dreamed of a white mist where bells rang without sheep. He dreamed of a golden hazelnut splitting open on its own, and inside there was no kernel, only a calm eye looking back. At dawn he woke tired and full of forest. The life of the valley, however, did not stop for the sake of a boy's fright. There was water to carry, chickens to chase out of the garden, kindling to gather for the fire, clothes to hang between two bursts of rain. Eonin did what he was told. He went to the well. He swept the threshold. He carried a basket to the widow next door whose leg troubled her. And while he did all that, the world began to seem almost normal again. Almost. Because now he found signs in places where before he had only seen habit. Passing a large stone by the entrance to the path, he noticed a bowl of milk freshly left there, and understood without anyone explaining for whom it was meant. He saw a shepherd pause at the edge of the forest, touch his chest, and leave 3 grains of salt on a stump before moving on. He heard 2 old women arguing over whether it was wise to cut holly on a cloudy Thursday. And for the first time he sensed that the argument was not mere superstition but calculation. The valley was full of small gestures that spoke with the unseen without naming it. That afternoon he went to look for Bran. The wagons from the fair were still down in the lower field, getting ready to leave the next day. He found the boy sitting on the axle of a cart, scraping dried mud from his boots with a stick. He had shadows under his eyes. "Hello," said Eonin. Bran looked up. His smile was weak. "Hello." An awkward silence settled between them. Then Bran shrugged. "I told my uncle we got distracted by a stream." Eonin did not know whether that annoyed him or not. "I told my grandmother." "Your grandmother already knew, surely." The line was half joking, half serious. Eonin sat down beside him. The field smelled of turned earth and horse. Beyond them, women were folding blankets. A small child was chasing a chicken. The day was clear, almost too bright, as if it wanted to wipe away every trace of the evening before by force. "I shouldn't have laughed," Bran said suddenly. Eonin looked at him. "No. I thought if I laughed, I'd be less afraid." The admission was awkward, but it mattered. Eonin, who had not yet learned the art of pretending he understood others when in truth he hardly understood himself, answered with the simplest truth he had. I was afraid too. Bran drove the stick into the mud. Do you think something will still happen to us? The question lay there bare. The two of them looked at it the way one looks at a wound, to see how much it hurts. I don't know, said Eonin, but I think pretending nothing happened would be worse. Bran let out a short, bitter little laugh. You talk like an old man. So do you, sometimes. That brought out a better smile from both of them. Later, when the sun was starting to lower, Miley appeared in the fairfield carrying a basket covered with cloth. She greeted Bran's uncle with the same grave courtesy she offered everyone, then beckoned the two boys to her. They walked a little way apart. Inside the basket were oat bread, a small bowl of butter, a jar of honey, and a handful of late summer flowers, yarrow, heather, white clover. Eonin understood at once. For the forest? He whispered. Miley nodded. Bran's eyes widened. I'm not going back in there. I'm not asking you to go in, the old woman said. Only to learn how to leave something carefully where before you wanted to take lightly. They walked together up the hill, this time without hiding from anyone and without the feverish excitement that had filled the adventure of the day before. The path looked different under the clarity of afternoon. The gorse glowed. Insects hummed over the flowers. Even so, as they neared the boundary, all three of them lowered their voices without thinking. They did not pass beneath the branches. Miley chose a flat stone beside the first hazel where the grass still belonged to the valley and the shade already belonged to the forest. She spread out the cloth. She placed the bread, the butter, the honey, and the flowers. Then she bowed slightly, not dramatically, only with the exact inclination needed to acknowledge that they stood before something not their own. For clumsiness, she said in a steady voice, for youth, for returning with better manners. Bran swallowed and lowered his head. Eonin did the same. The air smelled of leaves warmed by sunlight. No one appeared. There was no strange music, no moss-cloaked figure, only the soft creak of trees and the whisper of high wind. But that was enough. More than enough. The three of them stood in silence for a few moments, then walked away without looking back. The next day, before the wagons departed, Bran came to say goodbye. He gave Eonin a green glass marble, the only thing he considered truly valuable, according to his own measure of the world. It's not from the forest, he said. You can keep it. Eonin took it. Come back next summer. Bran smiled. Maybe, but next time we go to the river. The river. They bumped shoulders, which was the closest thing they knew to an embrace then. The wagons rolled away in one long, slow line, lifting dust behind them. Eonin watched until they were only a tremor on the road. After that, life went on, and as happens with things that truly teach, what had happened did not leave him. It settled inside him. Autumn came, the meadows darkened to a deeper green. Mornings woke silvered with frost, chimney smoke smelled richer. Apples were gathered, herbs were dried, roofs were mended. On cold nights, Miley spun by the fire and told half-finished stories. Not stories meant to frighten, but stories meant to sharpen attention. She told him of wells where it was unwise to look at your reflection at night, of hollow mounds where music could be heard on the eve of Samhain, of paths that had to be borrowed politely when they crossed ancient ground, of people as old as the hills, not always cruel and not always kind, but always sensitive to the tone with which they were regarded. Eonin listened, and he no longer heard only wonder. He heard structure. He heard that the world had fine seams and that a good life consisted partly in not tugging at them out of vanity. Some afternoons he climbed with his grandmother to a hill from which they could see the northern forest. They sat on an old blanket with a basket of bread and apples and let time pass. "Are you afraid it will call me?" Eonan asked once. Miley took a while to answer. "I don't think places call the way people do, but I do think some meetings leave a thread behind, and not all the threads are bad." "Then could I go back someday?" "Someday we all go back to the places that change us. The question is how." That answer went on living in him. The first frost came one white, silent morning. The puddles were thin glass, the low branches were edged with ice. Eonan, his hands reddened and his breath clouding in front of him, went to fetch wood from the shed. On his way back, he passed near the stone where they had left the offering weeks before. There was nothing on the stone, no hard bread, no dried flowers, no trace of the honey jar. Only 3 hazelnuts, large, polished, the bright, almost golden chestnut color. The boy stood still. He did not touch them. He did not call out. He looked toward the forest, resting under a bluish winter light. Between the bare branches floated the faintest mist, hardly more than a breath. Eonan laid one hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the wool. Then he bowed his head, the way his grandmother had done, and walked on with his arms full of wood. Winter settled fully into the valley with the patience of an ancient guest. It did not arrive all at once. It laid down layers, first cold mud, then hard mornings, then short afternoons, sheep huddling against stone walls, smoke rising straight when the air held still. And at last, one night, snow. Not a great storm, a gentle snowfall, thick flakes dropping in silence onto roofs, fences, branches, and roads until everything seemed to breathe more slowly. Eonan woke before dawn and went barefoot to the window. The whole world had been transformed. The valley, which in autumn had been a mix of dark greens, stone, and brown, was now all softness, white and blue. The northern forest rose at the far edge, darker for the contrast, its crowns heavy with snow and a faint silver vapor between the trunks. In the kitchen, Maylie was already awake, as though she never fully slept when the weather changed. "Put your boots on before you stare too much," she said without turning. Eonan obeyed, and he sat by the fire while his grandmother served him hot porridge. "Does snow change the rules?" he asked. Miley set down the spoon. "No, it only makes them clearer. Clearer. In summer, abundance deceives. Everything seems available. In winter, anyone can understand more easily that what sustains a life is not to be taken on a whim." Eonan looked at the misted window. He was not sure he understood completely, but he understood the feeling. In the cold months, every armful of wood, every piece of cheese, every basket of turnips carried weight. Nothing was just a thing. Everything was stored time. That winter he helped more than ever at home. His mother wove to order for other families. His uncle took the sheep to lower ground when the weather allowed it. Eonan hauled water, split twigs, cared for the cat, gathered eggs frozen with the cold of dawn. Work suited him. A busy mind stopped circling the forest quite so much. But not entirely. Some nights, while the wind struck the walls and the fire dwindled to a red pulse, he thought again of the woman in the clearing, of the voice in the mist, of the hazelnuts left on the stone as answer or greeting or proof of memory, and he wondered what it meant for a place to remember a boy. On the eve of Imbolc, while weeks of cold still lay ahead, but the promise of spring could already be sensed, Miley asked him to go with her to visit an old well between 2 hills east of the village. They set out at dawn. The air cut at their faces and smelled clean and metallic. Snow crunched under their boots. Miley carried a basket with white ribbons, a wax candle, and a small bottle of milk. "Is it for St. Bridget?" Eonan asked, remembering the women of the valley talking. "For her, for whoever listens," For the turning of the season, the old woman answered. It does no harm to be generous with more than one name. The well stood surrounded by bare hawthorns and stones glazed with ice. Others had already been there before them. Clean scraps of cloth, ribbons and little straw charms hung from the branches. Miley tied up a white ribbon with steady hands, poured a few drops of milk by the rim, and lit the candle sheltered from the wind. Eonan watched everything closely. Is it like leaving things at the forest? He asked. Sometimes, said Miley. The difference is whether you leave something to buy favor or to acknowledge presence. The boy thought about that while the flame trembled. And how can you tell? His grandmother smiled, and there was pride in it. By the state of your heart when you do it. On the way home, they walked a long stretch in silence. The low sun turned the snow into pale, almost rose-colored light. Crows drew black roads across the sky. Grandmother, Eonan said at last, what happens if someone promises too quickly? Maeli did not answer at once. Their boots left firm marks in the frozen path. Words are bridges, she said when she finally spoke. Some bridges are small, made to cross a stream. Others are long, meant for crossing a rough river. A promise is one of the long ones. If you give it without looking where it leads, later you may not have the strength to hold it up. And then it is not only the word that breaks, something in you breaks too. The second rule returned to him with new clarity. Until then it had seemed the strangest of the three. Take nothing, yes. Do not mock the mist, yes, but do not promise too quickly. That had sounded like adult advice, not protection against the forest. Now he was beginning to sense the hidden bond among all three. Taking, giving your word, laughing at what you do not understand. All three were forms of lightness, and the forest, he understood, could not bear lightness where weight was needed. When spring came, the valley seemed to wake inside a glass of clear water. Streams swelled. Lambs filled the fields with awkward bleating. The earth opened into a new green. Primroses, bluebells, and celandine showed along the banks. And with the return of mild weather came the desire to walk farther. Eonan had only grown a few inches, but something in the way he looked had widened much more. He was still a child. He still ran when it was time to run, laughed when it was time to laugh, climbed walls and smeared himself in mud. But he had gained that small pause that sometimes stands between impulse and action. One morning his mother asked him to carry bread and cheese to the family of a shepherd living in a cottage on the far side of the northern hill, not inside the forest, but close to its borders. Eonan agreed gladly. The walk was long, and he had already begun to love errands that came with horizons. Be back before the evening haze, his mother told him. I will. And don't take shortcuts. I won't. Miley, sewing by the door, lifted her eyes for a moment. And remember to listen to where you step. Eonan nodded. He set out with a basket on his arm, bread wrapped in linen, and a blackbird singing from wall to wall as he went. The day was clear, with high clouds and a gentle wind that smelled of running water. He climbed through paths lined with flowering gorse. He crossed a pasture where reddish cows grazed. He went over a bridge of flat stones above a lively stream darting between the rocks. At one point, the path forked. The right-hand path curved long and safe around the forest. The left-hand path looked shorter. It slipped for a stretch among the first trees before reappearing farther up. Eonan stopped. The temptation was small but distinct. It was not the reckless boldness of the first time. It was something more ordinary. A way to save time, a wish to prove to himself that he was no longer that child who had been lost in the mist. He looked at the left-hand path. In the spring light it seemed harmless. Then he remembered another thing Maeli used to say. Great mistakes often wear the boots of small things. He took a deep breath and chose the long road. For a moment he felt absurdly proud. Then he laughed at himself. Sometimes doing the right thing is not announced by trumpets or followed by revelation. Sometimes it is only turning right when no one is watching. He delivered the bundle to the shepherd's family, received a dried apple, and thanks in return, rested a few minutes by the door while a curly-haired little girl showed him a newborn lamb, and then started home with the sun a little lower. Halfway back, he heard someone crying. It was not a baby's cry or an adult's. It was a held-in, broken sob, the kind someone tries not to let out, and so it sounds sadder for the effort. It came from behind a hawthorn bush near the stretch where the path went around the forest. Eonin approached carefully. There, sitting on a stone, was a girl of perhaps 12 or 13, wearing a worn green cloak with brown hair full of dry leaves. Her eyes were red, and in both hands she clutched a little bronze clasp shaped like a leaf. When she saw him, she straightened at once. "I didn't mean to frighten you," Eonin said. She looked at him with a strange mixture of relief and reserve. "I wasn't frightened. It was a lie, but a small one, told to preserve dignity." "Are you lost?" he asked. The girl hesitated. "I'm looking for the road to unhurried." Eonin frowned. Unhurried was a small hamlet to the west. "Not near there at all." "You've come a long way out of your path." She lowered her eyes. "I know." There was something odd in the way she sat, as if she never fully rested her weight, as if her whole body had forgotten how to relax. Eonin also noticed that despite the leaves in her hair, her cloak was too clean, and the bronze clasp shone without a single scratch. "I can show you the direction," he said, "but you won't get there before dark." The girl lifted her eyes. "Could you walk with me part of the way?" Eonin opened his mouth to say yes. The word nearly came out on its own. It was polite to help. It was natural. It was an easy request. And then the second rule struck his memory. Do not promise too quickly. It did not mean distrust everyone. It meant not handing over the weight of a word before knowing where it would land. He took a moment, a real one. He felt the awkwardness of it. The girl waited. The wind moved through the gorse flowers. Far away, a crow cried once. "I can walk with you as far as the mill crossroads," he said at last. "From there, the road is clear, but I have to be home before the evening haze." The girl watched him in silence. For a fraction of a second, something in her expression seemed to change. Not anger, not disappointment, more like a brief kind of approval, as if she had been listening for a particular note and had finally heard it struck true. "As far as the mill crossroads will do," she said. They walked together. She said her name was Eileen. She had a soft voice and knew the names of flowers Eonin had never heard before. She also knew old songs, or fragments of them. She hummed a melody he vaguely recognized from Samhain nights, when families left candles in the windows and the wind seemed to bring footsteps from very far away. "Are you visiting?" Eonin asked. "Passing through," she said. Another answer that was true and not true. At the mill crossroads, the road to Dunarias opened westward between two ash trees. The stream ran clear only a few paces away. Eonin pointed the way. "It's there, you can't miss it." Eileen stopped. "You did well not to promise more than you could carry." A little cold moved along Eonin's spine, though the afternoon was mild. "What?" The girl smiled. It was not a cruel smile, but it was not entirely human either. Many people offer company in order to seem kind, and then, when the light falls or the path changes, they discover they cannot hold up their own voice. You measured yours. That is rare. The boy stood still. Eileen raised the leaf-shaped clasp to her lips and kissed it lightly as though it were a key. "Go back now. Your house is thinking of you." She stepped backward. Then again, the air shivered a little, the way it shivers above a fire, and suddenly where the girl had been, there was only the shadow of a young willow by the stream, its long branches moving over the water. Eonin did not run, but his heart was beating hard. He looked at the willow looked at him, in some way that had nothing to do with eyes. Then he gave a small, awkward, sufficient bow, and turned for home. That night he told Meili what had happened while they ate barley soup. "Do you think she was of the forest?" he asked. "I think she belonged to the side where forms change names easily," the old woman said. "Was she testing me? Perhaps, or perhaps she herself needed to know whether anyone still lived around here who knew how to use a promise carefully." Eonin thought of the girl, of the leaf clasp, of the willow. "She didn't seem bad," Meili nodded. "Most important things do not allow themselves to be sorted too quickly into good and bad. That is why manners matter." That spring went on, bringing him small encounters that were, at once, ordinary and not entirely ordinary. One morning he found white feathers on the threshold after leaving a bowl of milk outside for a thin, stray cat that prowled the house. Another afternoon he heard, from very far off, the same melody Aileen had hummed by the mill crossroads, and when he looked toward the forest he saw mist caught in the branches like combed wool. He never went too near, but he no longer felt entirely separate from it. Between his house and the forest there was now a kind of conversation at a distance, made of respect, memory, and limits. When Beltane came, the village lit fires on the hills. People sang, children ran wearing flower crowns. Animals were led between two small bonfires for health and protection. The air smelled of sweet smoke, flowering hawthorn, and warm earth. Eonin, with a poorly made garland on his head, danced until he was breathless. Later, when the flames had sunk and the sky was full of stars, he slipped a little away from the others and looked north. Above the forest, there was a ribbon of glowing mist, almost blue under the moon. He did not mock it. He did not raise his voice. He only watched, his heart calm the way one watches someone through a lit window, knowing there is no need to enter in order to feel accompanied. The small years of childhood do not move like the large ones. They are not measured by calendars, but by apples ripening again, by boots that suddenly pinch, by the height at which a branch no longer brushes your forehead. And yet, without making a sound, they pass. Eonin turned 10, then 11. He learned to braid rope, to tell the weather better by the smell of the air, to hear whether a sheep was bleeding from hunger or simple stubbornness. His mother let him take the small cart alone to the mill. His uncle began to speak to him of far pastures and fences the way one speaks to someone who will soon have to understand the land through new responsibilities. Meili remained the secret axis of the house. Sometimes she seemed more fragile, sometimes on the contrary, older and stronger than the stones of the valley. As the years passed, he also developed the habit of climbing up to the forest without entering it. Not always alone, sometimes with his grandmother, sometimes with a basket of bread to leave a crust for the birds near the boundary, sometimes simply to sit and hear the wind moving through the trees. He never crossed that border casually. If he came near, he did so awake. One late summer afternoon, when the heat had begun to withdraw and the light gilded the hills like thick honey, Meili asked him to go with her to gather berries near the northern stream. "But not beyond the split ash," she added. Eonin smiled. "I know." The old woman gave him an amused look. "You know now, and that deserves celebrating." They set out with empty baskets. The path was scattered with early leaves. Insects hummed low. The valley breathed with that mixture of fullness and weariness that arrives at the end of summer, when everything has given much and is beginning to gather itself back in. They picked blackberries, blueberries, and a few late herbs. Meili showed him how to choose the berries without pulling the tenderest branches. Always leave the first and the last, she said. For the bird, for the seed, for courtesy. Eonin filled half a basket carefully. The work was slow and pleasant. His fingers were stained dark red and purple. The air smelled of sun on leaves, ripe fruit, and the cool breath of nearby water. When they reached the split ash, Maëlie straightened slowly. One hand braced against her back. I'll rest here a little. She sat on a flat stone in the shade. Eonin set down his basket and sat beside her. From there he could see, a little higher up, the beginning of a fern-filled hollow sloping down toward the forest. In that dip, scraps of mist floated even though the rest of the day remained clear. Grandmother, he said after a while, did you ever go very far in? Maëlie did not answer at once. She was looking at the hollow as if remembering a road in the rain. Yes, the word fell softly. Why? She smiled faintly, for the same reasons anyone does. Love, loss, youth, curiosity, sometimes because there is no other path. Eonin turned toward her, newly intent. Maëlie did not often speak so directly of herself. What happened? I learned something much like what you learned, only later, and because of that, with more pain. The boy kept quiet. He knew the difference between a half-open door and a door that should not yet be pushed wider. Maëlie, perhaps grateful for that caution, went on speaking of her own accord. I had a friend when I was young, Nessa. She laughed a great deal, too quickly for her own good. One autumn she wanted to go in and fetch a branch of white rowan she had seen shining among the trees. She was not wicked. She only thought beauty was enough of a permission slip. Eonin felt a slight knot tighten inside him. Did she find it? She found many things. Music, a path that looked easy, a house where an old woman offered her rest and hot bread, a tablecloth embroidered by tiny hands, a window through which snow could be seen falling, though it was only October, and a question, only one. Will you come back tomorrow? My friend said yes, in order to be polite. Maëlie rubbed thumb against forefinger as if she still remembered the texture of that word. She came home before dawn, but she returned changed. She had a distant kind of joy, as if borrowed. The next day she wanted to go back, and we would not let her. She cried, she raged, she swore she had only given a courteous answer, that it did not count, that no one could take so small a word and make it weigh that much. But it counted, Eonin murmured. Yes, it counted. The wind moved a cluster of ferns. The mist in the hollow seemed to listen. What happened to Nessa? Eonin asked very softly. She lived, married, had daughters, grew old, but every winter eve she stayed awake looking north as though part of her still owed a tomorrow she had never fully understood. Eonin swallowed. Is that why you say promises are bridges? For that reason, and others. They sat in silence. A robin landed on the split ash and stared at them boldly. Below them the stream murmured among hidden stones. Grandmother, he said after a while, do you think the forest forgives? Maëlie let out a quiet breath. I think the forest remembers better than it punishes, and remembering is not always a misfortune. That line stayed with Eonin for many days. Not long after came Samhain. In the valley that night was prepared for with a mixture of solemnity and habit. Mirrors were covered, thresholds were cleaned. An extra plate was set at table, not out of empty superstition, but from an old hospitality that acknowledged the absent. Bonfires burned on the hills. The air smelled of roasted apple, smoke, and cold. That year, Maëlie asked Eonin to carry a carved turnip lantern to the boundary stone and leave it there before nightfall. Alone? He asked. Alone, you're not so little anymore. They carved the turnip together. They gave it round eyes and a calm smile. Inside, they set a short candle. When they lit it, The orange glow filled its simple face with gentle life. Eonin walked to the stone, while the sky shifted from pearl grey to deep violet. The first stars were appearing like stitches. From the village below came dim voices, dogs, a distant song. As he set the lantern down on the stone, he realized he was not alone. A few paces away, half hidden among the hazels, stood a very tall man, wearing a dark mantle edged with dry leaves. His hair was pale, almost silver in the last light. His face seemed at once young and old, like a carving freshly made from a very ancient tree. Eonin felt his pulse in his throat, but he did not step back. The man inclined his head with grave courtesy. "Maeli's house still remembers doors," he said. The voice was soft, deep, strangely musical. Eonin answered as best he could. "My grandmother taught me." "Yes." The man looked at the lantern. "Your carving is clumsy." Eonin glanced down at the turnip, embarrassed. "I know." Then the other smiled, not mockingly, with a kind sort of approval. "That is why it is good." The boy lifted his head a little. "Did you know my grandmother when she was young?" "I knew the way she walked before your parents were born. Some footsteps are remembered well." He said nothing more. Samhain was a night when the world turned more porous, and Eonin felt that questions had to be measured even more carefully than promises. The man held out a hand. In his palm lay a small strand of red wool, very fine, braided with a thread of silver. "For the door of your house," he said, "against ill wind. Not as debt, as greeting." Eonin did not reach out at once. He looked at the gift, then at the man, then at the shadow of the forest behind him. "May I accept it?" he asked, and realized he was really asking his absent grandmother the rules, the part of himself that had learned to pause. The man seemed to understand. "You may," he replied, "if you take it knowing that even a greeting asks to be remembered." That was enough. It was not without price. It was not without meaning. It was clear. Eonin received the braid in both hands. "I will remember." "I hope so." When he lifted his eyes, the man was no longer where he had been. Higher up among the trees, a white stag crossed an impossible clearing and vanished. Eonin brought the braid home. Maeli touched it with her fingers and closed her eyes for a moment. "It is well made," she murmured. "He told me it was against ill wind." "It is." They hung the braid above the door that very night. Throughout the next winter, though harsh rains blew in from the sea and dry frosts swept down from the hills, the hearth kept an odd, steady warmth. The fire caught easily. The animals were less sick than in other houses. And when fever moved through the valley, Eonin's mother suffered it only mildly. No one called it a miracle aloud. They only glanced now and then at the red and silver braid over the door with quiet respect. And so Eonin learned something else important. Not every tie to the old things was dangerous. There was also calm reciprocity, goodness that did not announce itself, protection offered to one who had known how to arrive with hands and voice in the right place. And still the rules did not lose their force. They gained it, because now he knew they were not threats, but keys. Take nothing, so as not to mistake gift for plunder. Do not promise too quickly, so that an empty courtesy does not become a chain. Never mock the mist, so as not to insult the boundaries that keep the world whole. He could not have put it that neatly into words yet. He was still too young for such polished sentences, but the truth of them lived inside him. One late winter afternoon, when the sky hung so low it seemed to brush the hills, Eonin climbed alone to the boundary stone. In his pocket he had a blue strand of wool that had come loose from his own cloak. He was not planning to leave it as an offering. He had only kept it without thinking. The stone stood empty, the forest beyond motionless. He slipped a hand into his pocket, felt the wool, and for an instant thought of tying it to a nearby branch. A pretty gesture, almost automatic. Then he stopped. There was no reason, no true one. He smiled a little to himself, tucked the strand away again, and sat on the stone to listen to the wind. Not doing something was also a form of learning. The spring of Eonan's 12th year came with a gentleness so clear it might have been spun by hand. The streams ran full, hawthorns burst into bloom. In the early mornings before the valley had fully awakened, a veil of haze lay over the fields and lifted slowly as if someone on the far side of the world were drawing back a sheet. By then the boy was known in the village for two things: for listening well to his elders without servility, and for knowing how to keep still when others filled the air with noise. He was not a sad or solemn child. He laughed with his friends. He ran at festivals. He got annoyed if he lost fairly at knucklebones. But he had the kind of calm some people acquire because once they were truly lost and found their way back by paying attention. One April noon, while helping mend a fence by the upper pasture, he heard unfamiliar voices on the road. Two men and a woman, travelers by the look of their boots and the dry road dust at the hems of their mantles. One carried a small lute slung over his shoulder. Another had a hazel staff freshly cut. The woman wore a pheasant feather in her hair and looked at the landscape with the reckless delight of someone who finds beautiful what she does not yet know. They asked for water, for bread, and for the shortest road to the western pass. Eonan's mother, hanging laundry nearby, offered to fill their skins and pointed them toward the long road around the northern hill. "The shorter way crosses the forest," she warned. "I wouldn't recommend it." The man with the hazel staff smiled. "We've crossed thicker forests than that." The woman raised her eyes toward the line of trees. "What can be strange about it? Every forest has mist at dawn." Something gave a small tug inside Eonan. Not fear, recognition. Maeli, sitting in the shade of the doorway shelling peas, spoke without raising her voice. "There are places where mist is only tired water, and places where only is not a wise word." The travelers exchanged a glance, polite, skeptical. The man with the lute bowed courteously. "We thank you for the advice, Mother." And from the tone, Eonan knew they would not take it. He watched them leave an hour later, following the path that led toward the forest. They said nothing openly insolent. They did not mock outright, but they carried that overconfident lightness of people who believe the world will be exactly as simple as they have decided it should be. By sunset, they had not reached the western pass. By full dark, they returned. Or rather, two of them returned. The man with the lute and the woman, tired, without the hazel staff, their clothes wet to the knees, and that disoriented look left by a whole afternoon spent walking without getting anywhere. "We lost Shiar," the woman said as soon as she stepped into the yard. "Or he lost us. I don't know." Eonan's mother gave them shelter at once. In the valley, no one left a traveler in trouble outside the fire, however foolish they had been. An extra candle was lit. Broth was served. A bench was cleared. Eonan listened from a corner as the two tried to explain. They had entered the forest around midday. The path was clear at first. Deeper in, they found a stone covered with old coins, buttons, pieces of mirror, and ribbons. Kiar, the man with the staff, picked up a little copper brooch, just to look at it. The woman told him to put it back. He laughed and said forests had no pockets to keep jewelry in. Then the mist began, then the circling, then distant music. Then Kiar said he could see a light among the trees and went toward it, though the others called after him. After that, nothing, only mist. Hours, the same trunks, again and again. Until at last, near sunset, they came out at a place they did not recognize, which turned out to be astonishingly close to the village. "He could still be in there," the woman said, and her voice broke. Maeli set the peas aside. "He may be, he may not. We go to the boundary, no farther. In good light, with the right voice, The man with the lute lowered his head, ashamed. "I'll go." "No," said Maeli. "I'll go. Eonan will come with me." The boy's mother opened her mouth to protest, but when she saw the old woman's expression, she only sighed. The next morning, the two of them climbed to the boundary with dark bread, a bowl of cream, salt, and a rowan branch tied with red thread. The morning was clear, too clear perhaps, as if the day, by contrast, wanted the foolishness of human mistakes to be plainly visible. The travelers followed a little way behind, but Maeli told them not to come beyond the old stone wall. "Wait here," she said, "and keep silent." Eonan went with her to the flat stone where offerings had so often been left. Maeli arranged the bread, the cream, and the salt. She wedged the rowan branch into a crack in the stone. Then she laid one palm upon it and spoke toward the trees. "We come for a fool who took without asking and walked without listening. We do not say his carelessness deserves reward. We only ask that morning find him again on the side where he was born." The forest did not answer in any visible way, but Eonan felt something, a depth, as though the shadow beneath the hazels had inhaled. Maeli continued, "The offense is his, the shame. Enough. We will add no more disorder if the path can be untangled here." A minute passed. Perhaps two. The boy could hear his own breathing, the tiny tick of a twig moving. A robin somewhere out of sight. Then from inside the forest came a cough. Then another, and a few moments later, in the dappled light between the trunks, Ciar appeared. He came slowly, soaked with dew. His eyes dazzled as if he were stepping out of a dream that had been too white. In his right hand he still held the copper brooch. When he reached the boundary, he stopped dead, looked at the object, and burst into tears. Not loudly, with a simple human shame that struck Eonan as almost more moving than fear. Ciar dropped to his knees, set the brooch on the stone, and pressed his forehead to the ground. "Forgive me," he whispered. Maeli did not touch him. She only waited. After a moment she said, "You may get up now." He did, trembling. Back at the house, the travelers did not speak much. They ate, they rested, and before leaving by the long western road, they left a sack of good flour and a spool of blue thread at the door in thanks. The woman embraced Maeli. The man with the lute bowed to Eonan with a seriousness that had nothing theatrical in it. Ciar came last. "Your grandmother is right about the mist," he said. Eonan nodded. "Yes." "And about taking things." "Yes." Ciar swallowed. "Do you think it will remember me?" Eonan thought of Nessa, of the hazelnuts, of the red and silver braid, of Eileen's voice by the stream. Then he answered with the honesty he had learned to prefer over easy comfort. "I think it will, but perhaps that will help you live better." Ciar looked at him a second longer and then smiled tiredly. "I hope so." When the travelers finally vanished beyond the southern hill, Maeli sat down on the stone bench in the yard and closed her eyes for a moment. She looked exhausted. Eonan sat beside her. "Did it take strength from you?" he asked. "A little. Because you spoke to the forest?" The old woman opened one eye. "Because I spoke to human stubbornness. That usually tires me more." Eonan let out a short laugh. "So did Maeli." Then she patted his knee. "You have now seen what the three failings do, separately and together." The boy looked at his hands. "Yes." "Then soon you won't need the rules as prohibitions anymore. They'll live inside you as habit." That summer, Eonan began going with his uncle to farther pastures. Sometimes they slept away from home, in stone shelters or beneath low branch roofs, keeping watch over the flock as the weather shifted. Nights in the hills were wide and silent. You could hear streams, bells, the turn of the wind in the heather. The boy learned the constellations and how to read dawn clouds. One of those nights, while the small fire burned down, his uncle said, without looking at him, Your grandmother told me about the forest when you were little. Eonin, lying on a blanket, turned his head. Did she tell you everything? Enough. Do you believe in those things? The man stirred an ember with a stick. I believe in not putting my hand into an anthill, not because I think ants are demons, but because they are ants, and I've no right to wreck their house. Eonin smiled in the dark. That doesn't answer. It answers enough. They looked at the stars. And besides, his uncle added, I've lived long enough to know the world doesn't stop where my understanding does. That line, spoken on the edge of sleep, stayed with Eonin just as Maelys had. He began gathering inside himself a small treasury of true sayings, not because they sounded beautiful, but because they were useful. At the end of summer, Bran came back with a larger caravan. He had grown a great deal, broader in the shoulders now, and he brought stories of ports, abbeys, markets, and muddy roads that smelled of horse and salt. He also brought a laugh that came less easily and a gaze that paid more attention. They recognized each other at once. They walked to the river just as they had promised years earlier, and sat on the same stone where they had first shared honey bread. I haven't mocked the mist again, Bran said, skimming a leaf off the water with a stick. Eonin smiled. Neither have I. And I don't take things from strange places. That helps too. Bran looked at him sideways, but I still promise too quickly sometimes. Then you still have work to do. They both laughed. Then Bran, more serious now, took a small piece of polished amber from his pocket. I found it on a beach in the east, he said. I bought it, I didn't steal it. Before giving it to you, I asked 3 times whether it was mine to give. Eonin accepted the golden stone. He held it up to the sun. Inside it seemed to sleep a drop of ancient honey. Then I take it gladly. They sat a while in silence, listening to the water. There was something beautiful in the way the memory of a shared foolishness had, over time, become a language between them. Not of shame, but of care. That night, back at home, Maeli saw the amber on the table and nodded the way one approves of a lesson well learned without needing to turn it into ceremony. Outside, the northern forest breathed beneath the moon, dark and whole. Inside, the fire crackled, and Eonin, who had once been a boy with scraped knees and untamed curiosity, was beginning to become someone capable of carrying the world with gentler hands. More seasons passed. Heather bloomed and faded. Frost embroidered and erased the valley more than once. Lambs were born, grew, and became sheep. Eonin's hands grew steadier. His voice grew deeper, and Maelys, though still precise, began to sound more fragile on rainy afternoons. She did not complain. She had never been a woman of complaints. But on some nights she asked earlier for the bench by the fire. Or she left certain tasks to Eonin that once she had done without a thought, climbing for dried herbs in the loft, reaching the oat sack, taking salve to the neighbour with aching joints. One autumn evening when the sky was full of long ash-coloured clouds and the air smelled of wet leaves, Maeli called him over. Tomorrow I want to go to the boundary. Eonin set down the basket of turnips he had been sorting. I'll go with you. She smiled. I was counting on that. They left the next day slowly. The old woman carried her hazel staff. Eonin carried a blanket, a bottle of milk, and a small fresh-baked loaf. Neither of them spoke much as they walked. Not from sadness, from good habit. Some silences are not emptiness, but companionship without demand. The forest received them with a low rustle of leaves. The hazels had already begun showing bare branches. The holly shone dark. In the air floated a fine mist, almost like pearl dust between the trunks. They came to the stone. Maeli sat carefully. Eonin spread the blanket over her knees and set down the milk and bread beside her. Today we have not come to ask for anything, she said, looking toward the line of shadow, only to give thanks. Eonin watched her. Why today? The old woman took a little time before answering. When she did, her voice held that calm of things already accepted. Because one learns to recognize when the year of one's life is beginning to turn the corner. A cold hollow opened beneath his ribs. Don't talk like that. Miley turned her clear eyes toward him, full of tenderness. Talking like that does not summon anything that was not already coming. It only sets the table, honestly. Eonin lowered his gaze. He was nearly a man now. His hands knew it. His steps knew it. The way others came to him for certain tasks knew it. And yet faced with that sentence, he felt very young again. Maeli touched his wrist. Do not fear peaceful endings so much. They are a rare grace. They sat in silence for a while. The boy could hear the wind moving through the higher branches. A robin appeared, perched on the stone, tipped its head, and flew off again. From deeper in the forest came a familiar sound, distant bells or something so like them that there was no point in telling the difference. Grandmother, he murmured at last, you never told me why you gave me those 3 rules and not others. Miley smiled, tired and luminous. Because the others are learned by living. Those 3 save a great deal of time spent astray. Then she pointed toward the fine mist. Look at it well. Eonin looked. What do you see? Mist among the trees. Yes. And what else? He narrowed his eyes. The mist moved slowly, entering and leaving among the trunks like white water. Sometimes it hit a path. Sometimes it revealed a holly bush or a stone. It did not seem to be trying to deceive. It seemed only to veil and unveil at its own pace. I see something that lets you see less, but maybe so that other things can be seen better when the time is right. Miley watched him with quiet pride. That's it. They left the bread and milk on the stone. Eonin helped his grandmother stand. Before leaving, she rested her palm against the trunk of the first hazel and closed her eyes for a moment. Thank you for the measure, she said. She added nothing else. Nothing else was needed. That winter, Miley slept more. She spent long afternoons by the fire with her sewing in her lap. Sometimes not really sewing at all, only holding the thread as though following a gentle thought. Eonin often sat beside her. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they did not. The house filled with that sad sweetness places carry when love is beginning to prepare itself to let go without ever stopping its care. During Yule, neighbors came to visit. There were oat cakes, stories, old songs. Miley smiled often, ate little. One night, while snow fell silently, she called Eonin by name. He went to her at once. The old woman was awake, very awake, with a special clarity in her gaze. Listen, she said. And in the still house beyond the wind and the soft crackle of embers, Eonin heard something. Bells, distant, delicate, like in the forest the afternoon when he had still been a child. He moved closer to the bed. Yes, Miley nodded. When I'm gone, do not cling too hard. You already know doors need their space. Tears rose to his eyes so quickly they took his breath away. Grandmother. She took his hand. Take nothing that has not been given. Promise no more than you can carry. Never laugh at what protects the world. That is enough for a life that is good enough. They were almost her last full words. She died 3 days later at dawn, while the snow was melting from the eaves and a pale light entered through the window. The valley mourned her as people mourn those who have woven much without making noise. There was bread for those who came, blankets over old shoulders, hands tightly held, stories told softly by the fire. They buried her near the hawthorn in the churchyard, from where the northern hill could be seen if one lifted one's head. Eonin spent the following weeks with a sorrow that was gentle and deep rather than violent, like carrying a warm stone in his chest. He missed her voice in every task, the way she arranged cups, the sound of her staff. Even her silences had a shape of absence now. When the first clear afternoon after the thaw arrived, he climbed alone to the boundary. He carried bread, milk, and 3 hazelnuts from the valley's last harvest. He did not know if it was right. He did not know whether it was needed. He did it because the gesture tied him to the continuity of the things she had tended. He arranged everything on the stone. Then he stood there for a while, unable to find words large enough. At last he said the simplest one. "She remembered you well." The forest remained silent. Then a faint gust moved the branches, and out of the mist came a robin. It perched on the stone, looked at the hazelnuts, pecked at the bread, and flew into the trees. Eonin smiled with fresh tears on his face. "Yes," he murmured. "I suppose that is enough." Spring returned, as always, as never before. The grief changed places. It was still there, but it no longer weighed the same. It mingled with work, with meals, with caring for his mother, with the voices of the valley, also with the forest, because now when he looked at the mist, he did not only remember the fear of a boy once lost or the warnings he had learned. He remembered Maeli sitting on the stone, giving thanks for the measure of things. One morning in early May, he climbed the hill before sunrise. He wanted to see first light on the trees. In his pocket, he carried the red and silver braid, now worn by years above the house door. His mother had replaced it with another made by human hands, pretty and practical, but the old one still smelled faintly of smoke and dry leaves. When he reached the stone, he held it in both hands. "I am not returning it out of rejection," he said to the still air. "I bring it because it served well." He laid it on the rock. When the sun began to rise behind the eastern hills, the mist among the trees lit up with pale gold. And in the middle of that brightness, only for an instant, Eonin saw figures. Not fully, not the way one sees people on a road, more the way one senses a presence behind an illuminated veil. A woman with a black braid, a girl beside a willow, a tall man with pale hair, and perhaps a small figure leaning on a staff, her head slightly tilted the way it used to be when she listened to something important. He was not afraid. He did not step forward. He did not call out. He only bowed his head. The figures, or the light, or the memory did the same. Then the sun rose a little higher. The mist thinned, and only trees, birds, and a beautiful spring morning remained. Eonin sat on the stone and breathed. And then, in a way that did not fully fit into words, he understood why those 3 rules had been enough. Take nothing, because the world is not a table laid only for your hands. Do not promise too quickly, because the tongue can bind more tightly than iron. Never mock the mist, because some veils are not made to deceive, but to keep the right distance between one thing and another, one house and another, one life and what surpasses it. He understood them not as commands, but as ways of walking. And while the valley below was waking, with its roosters, its smoke, its doors opening one by one, Eonin felt that at last he had learned why a child must hear certain truths before he runs farther than his name. Not because the forest was cruel, not because all beauty concealed a trap, but because some wonders open best to those who arrive with light hands, slow promises, and humility before the mist. He stayed there until the sun was high. Then he rose and made his way home with steady steps. As he passed the first hazel at the edge, he saw at one root 3 large hazelnuts, smooth and shining, the bright, almost golden color of chestnut. He smiled. He did not take them, and that small, calm gesture felt to him like the fullest form of gratitude.